Slavery is often characterized by images of enslaved individuals traipsing their chained and bleeding feet onto America-bound ships, ships towards the marketplace for sale, ships towards plantations to be worked until death. Many see Wilberforce's abolition of slavery in the 1800s as a triumph of humanity over barbarity. Slavery is, however, not merely a historic atrocity. It is a present reality for over 35 million people worldwide. Once shipped across the Atlantic, slaves are now trafficked throughout the world. Once trapped by chains, slaves are now hidden in basements in overseas factories. Once openly justified through science and religion, slavery is now implicitly condoned by consumer choices and the insatiable demand for cheaper products. The Slavery Convention defines slavery as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the power attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. In short, slavery is when someone is considered a piece of property, when someone is physically and emotionally owned. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects one's right not to be held in slavery. The decision of the European Court of Human Rights in CN in the UK highlighted that slavery is a modern problem. While it may no longer resemble the traditional picture of slavery dramatically presented by Hollywood, it is no less of an issue. Despite this fact, modern slavery is much less visible. It is hidden away within homes, normal workplaces, and in overseas factories. The case of Saladin in France demonstrates this, in which a 15-year-old girl was brought to France by Mrs. D. Mrs. D paid for her journey, and after a few months, she was linked to another couple. They forced her to work 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no pay, no holidays, no identity documents, and without authorization of her immigration status. The European Court of Human Rights held that the girl had been enslaved, and France had breached its positive obligations under the prohibition of slavery and forced labor. This video will argue that an individual's right to freedom from slavery is the most important of rights, and therefore superior to all other human rights. To do so, it will consider the argument of human rights as indivisible and the way in which one's right to freedom from slavery impacts this status. The video will then focus in on three key arguments. Firstly, if someone is enslaved, their remaining freedoms and rights are null and void. Secondly, that slavery is international and still most definitely prominent in first world countries. And finally, freedom from slavery is considered customary international law and jus cogens. Human rights are considered indivisible. Whether they relate to civil, cultural, economic, political, or social issues, human rights are inherent to the dignity of every individual. Consequently, all human rights have equal status and cannot be positioned in a hierarchical order. The improvement of one right facilitates the advancement of another. Likewise, the deprivation of one right adversely affects the other. The following arguments will demean this concept of indivisibility by proving freedom from slavery to be the most important of human rights.
Our first argument as to why freedom from slavery is the most important human right concerns the fact that if someone is enslaved, then their remaining rights and freedoms are effectively null and void. When someone is enslaved, it is not only freedom from slavery that is breached. Slavery strips humans from their inherent rights. When someone is enslaved, they are effectively owned as property. Therefore, their right to life, food, water, shelter, family, etc. are at the hands of another. More often than not, enslaved people, typically women and girls, are not educated, face sexual violence, do not have access to reproductive and maternal health care, and face critical malnutrition. These circumstances lead to clear violation of other human rights. A slave is unable to exercise the right of individual self-determination. Freedom from slavery upholds human dignity and human welfare because it enables humans to exercise their rights and freedoms independently.
Although New Zealand is in a far better position than countries such as India, which has an estimated 14 million enslaved people, New Zealand is no safe haven. In 2015, there were 600 people trapped in slavery situations in New Zealand. This statistic exceeds both the average annual road toll of 300 and annual homicide rate of 80. These issues have received considerable media attention and government investment in terms of preventative efforts, and whilst occurring at a comparable frequency, slavery is a subject of far less discussion and focused action. Slavery in New Zealand now exists mostly as forced labour and the results of human trafficking. Aside from humanitarian considerations, which are obviously the foremost concern, 83% of New Zealanders have specifically indicated they would cease to trade with unethical suppliers in a 2018 Consumer NZ survey. This indicates that companies trading unethically in terms of the rights of their workers would experience a significant loss of business if this knowledge became public. New Zealand is already party to 2 international labour organisation conventions that provide a framework for the elimination of forced labour: the Forced Labour Convention number 29 and the Abolition of Forced Labour Convention number 105. The Forced Labour Protocol provides guidance on how to eliminate all forms of forced labour, punish offenders, and protect victims. It updates and supplements the ILO Convention and explicitly recognises modern forms of trafficking for forced labour. While our laws and practices are largely aligned with the protocol, becoming party to it would send a clear message of the importance that New Zealand places on tackling forced labour and other forms of modern slavery. It would also align with government initiatives currently underway to address people trafficking, forced labour, and migrant exploitation more broadly. Discussing New Zealand's modern involvement with slavery is fundamental to the understanding that freedom from slavery is the most important, incredibly undervalued, and tragically underdiscussed right. This is a definite indicator that slavery is a universal issue and one that is rampant throughout the world indiscriminately.
A key point that really emphasises that freedom from slavery is the most important human right is the fact that the prohibition of slavery is deemed to be jus cogens. Jus cogens is a type of customary international law that is accepted and recognised by the international community as a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which can only be modified by a subsequent norm of general international law having the same character. It is the pinnacle of the hierarchy of sources of international law. Erga omnes obligations are created, which means there is an obligation from all states to uphold the jus cogens norm, in this case, prohibition of slavery. This obligation exists even where a state has not expressly consented to such a norm. Therefore, even without consent, a state remains under an obligation to ensure no derogation from the prohibition of slavery, even during times of public emergency. One's right to be protected against slavery is therefore absolute and can never be restricted. Notably, jus cogens norms must be accepted as being such a norm by the international community of states as a whole. Thus, it is hugely symbolic for the prohibition of slavery to be accepted and deemed a jus cogens norm. It proves that there has been widespread consensus of the importance of this fundamental right and indicates the seriousness with which the international community regards slavery. As well as symbolic consequences, the recognition of prohibition of slavery as a jus cogens norm also has practical effect. It means national, legislative, administrative, or judicial acts that authorise slavery become illegitimate. In conclusion, without freedom from slavery, other rights that we exercise in day-to-day life could not be enjoyed. Slavery is present in developed and developing nations alike, proving that it is a universal issue that does not discriminate by country or race. Ultimately, the mere fact that the freedom from slavery is deemed to be jus cogens shows the vital importance of this human right and the need for it to be universally recognised and upheld. Given jus cogens is the pinnacle of the hierarchy of sources of international law, perhaps freedom from slavery being a part of this means it is the pinnacle of the hierarchy of international human rights.